A house remembers what its owners forget. Beneath the ticking of clocks and the polish of law lies something older than inheritance, the ache for truth, however inconvenient. In the quiet corridors of privilege, silence can be more deadly than malice and far harder to trace. Where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments and settle in. The answers here are slow to rise, but once they do not fall quietly. Let's begin the story. The letter had come not stamped nor sealed, but folded with care and carried by hand. It bore no official heading, merely a quiet note in Mr. Monsil's restrained handwriting. Would Superintendent Battle spare him 10 minutes? Entirely unofficial, of course. No urgency expressed, yet the paper held a weight not wholly due to ink or fold. Battle, who understood the currents beneath courtesy better than most, made no fuss. He replied as simply as the request, and by mid-morning, coat collar turned modestly against the London fog, he passed through Chancery Lane unnoticed by all but the street sweeper. Fell and Monsil was not the sort of firm that advertised its presence. Its discreet brass plate bore the name in seraphed restraint, and the door behind it gave way to something older than law, tradition, varnish, and silence. Battle climbed the stairs slowly, as if each tread was an overture to the conversation he was about to enter. He did not need to be told that Mr. Monsil's invitation bypassed every formal conduit a solicitor typically followed. It was, in its very reticence, a breach of protocol, and in this world such a breach was the first kind of whisper a man like Battle listened for. The office, when he entered, was dim with the filtered grey of an overcast morning, its walls lined with oak and the unspoken weight of 1,000 sealed documents. Dust did not seem to settle here, or if it did, it had been taught discretion. A fire crackled at a decorous remove, not for warmth but continuity. Mr. Monsil stood, not from obligation but instinct, and gestured quietly to a worn leather chair. There were no preliminaries. The air between them was already heavy with that curious prelude to disclosure, two men who understood the value of silence, waiting for it to serve its purpose. He did not rush. He poured a single cup of tea, not two. That was Monsil's way of indicating this was not hospitality but something else entirely. The delay, the slow placing of the cup on the table, the folding of his thin hands in his lap, spoke more urgently than any telegram. When he did speak, it was in the quiet voice of a man accustomed to confidences, and yet troubled to carry this one. Sir Edmund Fulbright died the day before yesterday, he said, eyes fixed not on Battle but on a darkened pane of glass above the hearth. In his study at Honeygarth, natural causes are assumed. But he hesitated. The matter is not entirely straightforward. Battle, seated motionless, did not interrupt. His eyes, pale and steady, took in Monsil's words and more, the rhythm of his breathing, the slight tremble of the fingers, the way his voice faltered, not at death, but at uncertainty. That was always the key. Death, in its finality, never frightened these men. It was the unfiled clause, the error in continuity, that turned them grey. The solicitor's office had a way of reflecting the men who kept it. There was no clutter, no stray scrap of paper. Even the inkwells looked too precise to have ever seen real use. The bookcase, housing rows of calf-bound ledgers, bore no dust but seemed untouched all the same. A heavy pendulum clock, inherited from an earlier partner and still wound with reverence, marked the hour with a sound closer to breath than chime. Battle stood as Monsil led him through to the inner office, not grand, but enclosed, weighted with an atmosphere of precision. Here, matters of legacy were considered not with sentiment, but with structure and finality. On a side table lay a leather folder, its edges worn. Monsil did not offer it. Instead, he folded his arms behind him and spoke again, softer this time. "Sir Edmund came to us 3 weeks ago. He requested a new will, a drastic alteration in fact. It was executed this past Thursday. He died late that evening." He paused. "The new heir is unexpected." Battle waited. "Miss Lydia Gray," Monsil said at last, drawing the name from some reluctant wellspring, "previously unknown to the family, or to us." The silence after the name was not empty. It filled the corners of the room, pulled beneath the table legs. Battle let it linger, as though observing how long it would take for the quiet to feel unnatural, but it never did. In such a place, silence had been bred into the wood. He moved then, slowly, thoughtfully, and accepted the folder at last. He did not open it, not yet. His hand rested upon it as if to judge its weight through the leather. Paper, he knew, could carry more than any stone. "What troubles you?" he asked, his voice barely above a murmur. Monsil, unexpectedly, laughed, a brief, breathless sound. "I'm not certain," he said, "but it's the sort of uncertainty I felt once before, when a will came to us already signed, sealed, and post-dated. A minor estate, long ago, it turned out to be genuine. But this," he looked to the fire, then back again. "There's something brittle in it, the speed, the sealing, and the way Sir Edmund looked, when he signed. As if he feared he would not finish the line." Battle opened the folder at last. The paper inside bore the marks of haste only discernible to those who looked for them. Ink bled at the edges, a slight shift in pressure midway through the signature. Nothing dramatic, nothing damning, but nothing ordinary either. He looked up, eyes unreadable. Monsil swallowed. "You'll say I'm being fanciful, and perhaps I am." "Not," Battle replied simply. "You're being cautious." And with that, the meeting passed into memory, but not into forgetfulness. For Battle, memory was not a storehouse, it was a map. Monsil stood with his back to the fire, now one arm folded across his chest, the other tapping, slowly, almost imperceptibly, against his sleeve, with a rhythm only he seemed to hear. When he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped a register. It was the tone of a man offering something that might be better left untouched. "She is called Miss Lydia Gray," he said. The syllables, once spoken, hung briefly in the room. Not with drama, neither man was given to theatrics, but with the quiet dissonance of an unfamiliar note struck in a familiar chord. Battle did not respond. He looked not at Monsil, but at the far wall, where the mahogany shelves held volumes of legal text bound in near-identical brown. His silence invited elaboration, but not demandingly so. "A name we had not encountered before," Monsil continued, more cautiously now. "She is not listed in any of the family correspondence. There are no references in his personal files, no known relation, not officially." Battle's head tilted just slightly. That movement alone was enough. "She has been traced," Monsil admitted. "Lodging modestly, somewhere near Bloomsbury. A nurse by profession, records show she was employed for some time in a private convalescent facility on the coast. Sir Edmund was a patient there, 5 years ago." There was no further elaboration. It did not need stating aloud that the old man had recovered slowly, that a certain intimacy could develop in such confined, vulnerable circumstances, that some debts are not always financial. Battle simply turned a page in the document, resting on his knee. Monsel's voice dropped again, now more a thought spoken aloud than a statement. "She seemed surprised by the news." There was a pause, a long one. She has not contested it, not yet, nor has she made any public acknowledgment. The solicitor moved toward the window, drawing back the curtain a shade. Outside, the street remained still, the fog pressing in against the panes as if listening. He let the curtain fall, and returned to the hearth. "I can't explain it," he said. "The choice, the change, not unless," but he left the rest unsaid, unwilling to allow speculation to escape into the air of his office. Battle looked down once more at the name, handwritten in steady ink across the third clause of the new will, to Miss Lydia Gray, of number 4 Spinney Terrace, all properties real and residual, known as the Honeygarth estate, including. He stopped reading. The language was legal, but the choice was personal. The dichotomy was always telling. Monsil resumed his place by the desk, resting his fingertips against the surface. "It is not the sort of decision one expects from a man like Sir Edmund," he said gently. "Not at any rate, without an explanation." Battle did not agree aloud, nor contradict. Instead he returned the page to its folder, carefully aligning the edges before closing it with one deliberate movement. The name lingered in his mind, not for its novelty, but for the absence of any trace around it. In a life so thoroughly recorded, so legally bound, Miss Lydia Gray had entered at the end, sudden, unacknowledged, uncontextualized, and sometimes it was not the presence of a name, but its failure to echo, that mattered most. Monsil's recollection of the final visit was precise in structure, yet faintly strained at the corners. There had been a note requesting a midday appointment, not unusual. Sir Edmund had arrived alone, early by 10 minutes. He looked tired, the solicitor remembered, and less robust than usual. His hand trembled when reaching for the pen. That too had been unusual. "I offered him water," Monsil recalled, as if this gesture bore some deeper significance. "He declined, said he preferred to do it quickly." Battle raised no eyebrow, no word. He merely inclined his head, the way one might acknowledge a piece moved on a chessboard. The document had already been drafted from our earlier notes. He read it once, slowly, then he signed. Monsil walked to a locked drawer and removed a smaller envelope, cream stock, sealed. He brought this with him, gave it to me just before leaving, asked that it remain unopened until I received word of his death. That struck me as unusual. Battle took it carefully but did not open it. His thumb rested on the wax seal which bore the Fulbright crest, an acorn within a laurel wreath. There was no address, no date, only the name Henry Monsil, Esquire, written in neat, almost old-fashioned hand. He seemed strained, Monsil continued, not frightened, not regretful, but underweight. Battle's eyes returned to the envelope, then briefly to the folded will. He said nothing of the way the ink had pooled just beneath the first curl of the E in Edmund, nor of the faint pressure line near the end where the pen had paused, not lifted, as though the writer had caught breath. These were the things that did not appear in legal testimony, yet formed the fabric of truth. When the solicitor excused himself briefly to take a telephone call, Battle remained seated. His gaze, however, was in motion. It moved not across the room, but through it, absorbing not facts but habits. The fountain pen upon the tray had no cap. Its nib glistened faintly, as though still wet. The blotter beside it, however, was untouched. Not a single impression. He leaned forward. A faint indentation from the pen's weight suggested it had been placed back without haste. That was not like Sir Edmund, nor, for that matter, was it like Monsil. On a shelf near the corner stood a tray of correspondence marked pending, private. One envelope lay askew, bearing a date from the week prior. Battle made no move toward it, but noted the handwriting, upright, forceful, sparse, not Sir Edmund's. The clock ticked, too polite to chime. The sound reminded Battle, as such sounds often did, that time could be observed but never questioned, only those who bent it. Monsil returned with the facsimile, printed crisply on heavy bond paper. Battle took it, not to read, but to hold. The weight of copied decisions, he thought, was always heavier than the original. There was no ink here to smudge, no paper to tear, only the ghost of a man's intent, reproduced for clarity but drained of texture. He read it in silence from the heading down through the clauses, until the signature. That was where he paused longest. "Would you care for a fresh copy?" Monsil asked. "No," Battle said softly. "This one will do." The solicitor inclined his head. "And if I may ask, do you find it troubling?" Battle folded the facsimile, then unfolded it again. "I find it recent." Monsil smiled thinly, as are most mistakes, but Battle did not smile. His attention had returned to the name, the ink, the pressure of the line. Somewhere beneath that final curl of the T, in Fulbright, something was missing, not in the paper, nor the seal, but in the hand that wrote it. Something not erased, but deliberately omitted. And omissions, Battle had long known, were far more deliberate than errors. The path from the gate to the front portico of Honeygarth was gravelled with care, yet the crunch beneath Superintendent Battle's boots felt oddly subdued, as though the stones themselves had learned to mute their protest. A chill breeze stirred the dormant ivy against the stone facade, and beyond the upper windows, the grey sky pressed low, thick with the kind of Sussex silence that hung more heavily than fog. The housekeeper met him without ceremony, ushering him into a hall so polished and bare it seemed preserved, not lived in. The banister gleamed, the portraits frowned, and the air smelt faintly of wood polish and winter apples stored somewhere unseen. Battle removed his hat slowly, offering no unnecessary remark. His gaze drifted to the corners of the room, to the threadbare carpet runner that stopped just short of the parlour door, to the unopened umbrella, leaned carefully behind the coat stand, small things that did not quite belong to mourning, but seemed to accompany it anyway. He was led not to the drawing-room, but to the library, a sign, perhaps, that the family had not quite decided whether grief should make them private or performative. There was a tension in the house not loud enough to name. It ran under the floorboards, behind the doors, beneath the strained politeness of every footfall. A house not grieving, Battle thought, but waiting, for what precisely was yet to be determined. The door to the library opened with a muted creak. Major Leonard Fulbright did not rise from his chair. He had the stance of a man bred for command, but forced to yield. Leonard sat rigidly in the leather armchair near the hearth, one leg crossed too neatly over the other, his hand resting on the carved arm as though it might be called upon to make a decision. Battle gave a small nod, not deference, but acknowledgment, and remained standing. "So," said the Major, after a moment's silence, "you're the man Monsil sent." His voice was clipped precise with an undercurrent that might have once passed for wit, now curdled into something "I asked for no inquiry. I've had enough of officials for a lifetime." Battle offered no immediate reply, merely shifted his weight, taking in the shelves, full of histories, memoirs, law books in fading gilt. The portrait above the fireplace was of Sir Edmund, younger, moustached, eyes inscrutable. The same gaze, perhaps, his nephew had learned and failed to wear convincingly. "My uncle," Leonard said, the word catching only faintly, was not a man to act on impulse. If he made a change to his will, it would have been with full understanding. Battle inclined his head, his expression unreadable, which, Leonard continued, makes the result all the more absurd. The word hung, absurd, not shocking or unjust. A vocabulary drawn from officers' messes and London clubs, detached, dignified, embittered. "She was a nurse," he added suddenly, as though startled by his own bluntness. He met her during some minor illness, convalescence, nothing serious. She is not family, she is not even known. He stood now, pacing, his boots soundless on the faded rug, and yet, all of it, the house, the grounds, the collection, to a girl who may or may not be his. His what? Protégé? Invention? Legacy? Battle said nothing, his stillness not passivity but containment. Leonard turned sharply, frustrated not by the silence, but by what it concealed. I suppose you'll find out what you came to find out, in time. Battle regarded him calmly. Most things, Major, are not hard to find. It's the ones we think are settled that usually shift beneath us. Leonard faltered for the briefest second, not a confession, but a hesitation, then straightened, face hardening. I shall be in the study if you need anything further, he said curtly, and departed without another word. Eleanor Fulbright did not rise either, though her posture in the window seat suggested an almost sculptural elegance. She turned slowly as Battle entered the morning room, her expression serene, her eyes as sharp as frost. "You'll excuse my not standing," she said lightly. "I've found lately that one learns more from the vantage of stillness." Her voice was soft, well-bred, with the faintest drawl of someone who had lived abroad but was too polite to make it a feature. Her hands lay folded in her lap, gloved, though the fire was lit. Battle offered the same quiet greeting, and stood just within the doorway. "I'm told you're here unofficially," she said, watching him. "That seems to be how everything is handled lately." She smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind one places between themselves and the world, polished to the point of transparency. "I imagine Leonard has made his feelings clear." Battle remained silent, as he always does. She reached to lift a porcelain cup from the tray beside her, her movement graceful. He expected to inherit, as did I. But expectation is not entitlement, is it, Superintendent? There was no bitterness in her tone. That was perhaps the most revealing thing of all. "I never saw her," she added, after a pause. "Miss Grey, though I dare say I've imagined her enough times since." Her gaze flicked toward the window. "I wonder if she looks like him. There was a woman once, long ago, nothing ever spoken, of course. But I was younger then, and more curious. We learn to suppress curiosity in houses like this." Battle did not respond, but his eyes moved. To the side table, where a copy of Debrett's rested, not open, but clearly used. To the flowers, carefully arranged but already wilting. To the lace curtain drawn slightly higher on the left, revealing not the garden, but the gravel path leading to the side gate. "I trust you'll be discreet," she said finally, placing her cup down without clatter. "There's been enough unseemliness without headlines." Battle gave the faintest of nods, not agreement, but acknowledgement. Eleanor inclined her head with practiced composure, already turning her attention to the next movement in the household ritual. He stepped back through the door without noise. Behind her stillness, he sensed the calculation ticking. She stood in the east-facing parlor, not seated, not settled. Her hands were folded at the wrists as if they did not know quite what to do with themselves, and her shoulders bore the posture of someone trained in stillness, not innate, but learned. Lydia Gray did not look like an heiress. She looked like someone waiting to be dismissed. Battle entered quietly. The air in the room had the faint scent of camphor and closed shutters. A needlepoint cushion had been carefully straightened on the window seat, and the vase on the escritoire held a single sprig of fading lilac. The effect was neither welcoming nor hostile. It was a room made for pause, not presence. Miss Grey turned at his approach, her expression uncertain. She was younger than he had expected, not girlish, but unweathered. Her dress was plain, of quality carefully maintained. The gloves she held were worn soft at the fingertips. "I was told I might speak with you," she said, her voice low, precise, as though reciting a lesson learned under duress. "I don't know what I'm meant to say." Battle gave a small incline of the head but did not sit. He regarded her with the stillness that often made people uncomfortable, not from scrutiny, but from what it invited them to reveal in the silence. "I was surprised," she said, after a moment. "I hadn't seen him in years. I didn't know he would remember me." There was no preamble, no attempt to disguise the emotion she could not quite control. She was not tearful, but her voice bore that ragged quality that comes from holding something too long, too tightly. "I was his nurse, nothing more." Battle watched her as she spoke, not the words but the rhythm. How she paused between phrases, how her eyes flickered not toward him, but toward the window, as though measuring the space she now occupied against what she believed she deserved. "I thought, perhaps, a letter might come. A token, a book, even. Not this." She looked down then, and the gesture was not rehearsed. It was, he thought, entirely honest, the posture of a person who finds themselves unwillingly written into someone else's story. No further questions were asked. None were needed. He merely inclined his head again and stepped back. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Ridley, who brought the matter of the letter into the open, not intentionally, not even as an offering of assistance, merely as a detail noted in passing during a conversation about linens and who had access to Sir Edmund's study in the final days. "It was there that morning," she said, pausing as she adjusted the brass fender along the grate. "A sealed envelope, laid square on the blotter, just like he always did when something was to be taken to the post. He used that red wax he liked, with the Fulbright crest. I remember thinking it odd. He rarely sealed things himself anymore." Battle said nothing. When I went back, it was gone. The timing of the observation, vague. The language, careful. It had not occurred to her until that very moment. The absence. She had not thought to report it. That, too, was telling. In houses like these, one did not report absences unless invited. She hesitated again, then added, "It had Monsil's name on it, in his own hand." And that, Battle thought, was not a detail to be supplied lightly. The fireplace in the study was rarely used. The grate bore the lightest trace of ash, brushed away, but not thoroughly. Battle crouched, not out of need, but from habit, placing himself at the level of what remained. Within the ashpan, one corner of thick paper had survived, not enough to read, but enough to identify. The edge was serrated in the particular way Monsil's stationery was trimmed, a detail unlikely to be known outside legal circles. The wax, once red, had melted unevenly and left a faint trace on the hearthstone. The letter had been destroyed in haste, but not entirely. He looked next to the writing desk. The inkwell, empty, bone-dry, not from recent use but neglect. A pen, its nib crusted. The blotter, curiously unmarked, though the sheet beneath it had impressions of unrelated scrawl. A memorandum. No, a list, names perhaps, or figures. He made no notes. Nothing needed recording yet. Everything could be remembered in sequence, shape, position, absence. Then his attention turned to the grandfather clock in the corner. It stood tall, unchimed, hands halted at 22 minutes past 10. The mechanism had not been wound. Perhaps it had stopped on the night of Sir Edmund's death. Perhaps not. But there was something symbolic in it, the final stillness of time in a house where nothing else moved quite as it should. The parlor had emptied, the silence had settled into the walls. It was not peace, but a temporary withdrawal, the kind families enacted when watched too closely. Battle did not move to leave. He remained where he had been seated, hands folded quietly, allowing the silence to grow long and untroubled. He was not waiting for someone to speak. He was allowing space for what had not yet been said to rise into the stillness. Eleanor had retreated to her room, feigning a headache. Leonard had gone to his uncle's study and not returned. Lydia had been shown to the guest quarters in the East Wing, far from the family corridor. He considered each face as it had appeared that morning. Not the expressions, but the absence of certain expressions. Shock unvoiced. Anger veiled. Guilt not shown, but displaced. The burned letter, the dry inkwell, the sealed envelope now vanished. All things intended for delivery, and all intercepted. The house had not been prepared for an inheritance. It had been prepared for silence, and yet the silence had been disturbed. The questions he had not asked, the ones each member of the household had answered nonetheless, formed themselves now into a sequence. Not an accusation, not yet, but a pattern, and Battle trusted patterns more than he trusted men. He reached for his coat, not to leave, but to begin the work of returning. Not everything had been said, but enough had been shown. The office had not changed. It never did. The air retained that understated scent of polished wood, sealed envelopes, and men who seldom raised their voices. The reception clerk nodded as Battle entered, not out of recognition, but from adherence to a tradition of courteous neutrality. He made no remark, no inquiry. That, too, was policy. Here the business of others passed through hands without lingering in them. Battle stepped into the antechamber and paused. The grandfather clock ticked with dutiful restraint, each stroke neither hurried nor delayed. The floor, a grid of soft leather tiles, gave no echo. On the panelled walls hung oil portraits of former partners, narrow men with fixed expressions, each bearing the weight of decisions made, signed and filed without flourish. He removed his gloves slowly, allowing the moment to settle, and was shown without ceremony into the inner chamber. Mr. Monsil rose as before, but less formally this time, as though something in their previous meeting had removed the need for ritual. The two men stood for a moment, in companionable silence, not from awkwardness, but from a mutual understanding that words, when used at all, should be earned. The solicitor gestured toward the table. "We've reconstructed the timeline." Battle nodded once. Monsil drew out a slim folio and opened it with precise care. "Sir Edmund contacted us by post on the 4th of last month. Requested an appointment regarding his will. There was no mention of amendment, only of review. He arrived a week later. That's when he expressed his intent to make significant changes." He paused, not for effect, but to ensure the weight of the word significant had registered. It had. "He was not the man I remembered," Monsil continued. "Thinner, tired. His speech unhurried, but not vague. He knew what he wanted. That's the curious part. He came with it already fixed in his mind." Battle leaned slightly, his hand resting flat on the table's edge. He did not interrupt. He specified the removal of all previous heirs except for a single small bequest to the nephew. Everything else was to be transferred to Miss Lydia Gray, real, residual, and liquid assets. Monsil closed the folder softly. We asked if he had consulted with his family. He said he had not, nor did he intend to. Battle's gaze moved to the chair opposite, unoccupied, its cushion faintly indented. Someone had sat there recently. A client, a partner, perhaps no one. But the rhythm of occupancy in such offices followed patterns, and patterns meant something. There were no letters of explanation. Battle asked, voice quiet. Monsil hesitated. "None that we received," and that too was an absence that echoed. The name came from a page in a staff record, buried in a medical register obtained with quiet efficiency. Lydia Gray, listed as a nurse, trained modestly, employed at St. Hester's Convalescent Home, near Rye. Her tenure overlapped precisely with Sir Edmund's 6-week recovery after a minor stroke, 5 years prior. The matron remembered her. Quiet, she had said. Never the sort to involve herself with the others. Not unkind, just distant. There were no incidents, no reprimands, no commendations. A woman who entered, worked, and left, like a figure penciled lightly into a larger portrait. Erasable, if needed. Battle said little but noted the placement of her name on the rota. She had been the attending nurse for Sir Edmund's final 3 weeks at the facility. The duty logs confirmed it. There was no correspondence between them after his departure. No phone calls, no mention in her file. And yet, 5 years later, her name would stand alone atop the Fulbright estate. In such silences, motives took root. It was a junior partner, eager, faintly nervous, who offered the next observation. Battle had asked no direct question, only commented mildly on how many wills the firm saw altered in a typical quarter. Quite a few, the young man had replied, though rarely as comprehensively, and then almost as an afterthought, I did hear a rumor from one of the clerks about a letter Sir Edmund wrote before he passed. Not to us, I don't think. Possibly to someone in the family. Battle did not press, but the comment led, in time, to the clerk himself, a pale, long-fingered man named Hedden, who kept his spectacles on a chain, and had the wary disposition of someone trained to see what others miss but never speak of it. Hedden recalled the night in question, or rather the call. Just after 10, sir. Office line rang. I was doing archive entry. It wasn't a wrong number. The line cleared, but there was no name, no request. Just the click of someone realizing they had rung too late. He paused. It was a house line. I've done some work on probate. You come to recognize the silence of certain rooms. Battle considered this without expression. And you said nothing. There was nothing to say, Hedden answered, without defensiveness. Until now. The records room lay behind a narrow corridor, its oak door unmarked. Here the firm stored not only files but decisions. The air smelled of paste and paper, a scent Battle associated not with memory, but with closure. He stood at the threshold, unmoving, and allowed his mind to gather the fragments. A man, long held in esteem, chooses to rewrite his legacy without counsel. A woman, once a nurse, now inheritor of a title she never expected. A letter sealed, and never found. A signature hurried, perhaps unfinished. And a telephone call that reached no one, but said enough in its absence. Nothing so far suggested murder, but very little spoke of peace. Battle stepped inside. There were patterns, always, in the arrangement of archives. It was not merely law that was stored here, but intention. One shelf bore the fallouts of contested estates, bitter disputes that turned blood into adversaries. Another held cases of quiet bequests, the childless, the penitent, the isolated. Sir Edmund's file, when located, rested uneasily between them. Battle did not open it. Not yet. Instead he stood in the stillness, watching the dust drift through the shaft of pale afternoon light. In the quiet hum of nothing happening, the shape of something else began to form, not in action, but in the pattern of what had already been done. He left the file where it was. Its time had not yet come. Battle did not arrive by motor. He walked the final stretch from the station, his pace unhurried, hat brim low, and coat shoulders squared against the breeze that swept the lanes with a faint scent of turned soil and wood smoke. The gate to Honeygarth gave only the gentlest creak when nudged open, and the house itself received him without fanfare. No bell, no butler summoned, only the faint echo of his steps on the stone flags and the sound of someone, somewhere, setting down a teacup too carefully. He did not explain himself, only offered the briefest nod to the parlour-maid, who opened the door. Her face registered no surprise. At Honeygarth, the unexpected was not spoken of until it had settled into the furniture. He requested no audience, gave no indication of urgency, and declined refreshment when it was murmured as an obligation. He was not inspecting, not yet, he was observing. The air held its familiar mixture of beeswax and withholding. The curtains had been drawn back fractionally farther than before. The grandfather clock had resumed ticking. Someone had wound it, but too recently, its rhythm now too brisk for age. He asked to be left to walk the house. It was not a question. The study door had been unlocked by the time Battle reached it. No key had been presented, no formal invitation extended. Yet the door, when touched, yielded. The room was, as it had been described, not grand, but deliberate. The desk sat broad and austere beneath the tall sash window, its blotter undisturbed, the edges crisp and square, as if cut only yesterday. A small inkstand sat to the right, the stopper in place, the contents dried to a dull crust. The pen beside it was laid parallel to the blotter, too precise. Battle moved it half an inch, and watched it roll gently back into alignment. Not habit then, performance. He stepped once to the right, noting the angle of the chair, not tucked in, nor pushed aside. It sat as though someone had only just risen, and not comfortably. The laudanum bottle, tucked into a side drawer of the desk, was capped, full. Its label bore no recent smudges, and yet there were smudges on the drawer handle, faint, oily, a print half-formed and blurred. Someone had opened it, looked, and left it untouched. He stepped to the fireplace. The hearth bore no ash, but a faint crescent of soot at the back indicated a single page or two had been burned, not logs. Controlled, done with purpose. He knelt, removed a glove, and pressed 2 fingers lightly to the grate's edge. Cold, not since the night itself. The windows were clean save for one pane to the far right that bore the faint mark of a fingertip, long and arched, as if someone had leaned close to look out, or inward. He circled the room once more. The carpet beneath the desk bore no pressure marks from recent use, but there were faint scuffs on the runner by the door, parallel, not converging. Someone had lingered there, long enough for the pattern to etch itself into the silence. He left the room without adjusting a thing. There was in some places more truth in dust than in testimony. The girl was named Alice, and she had the look of someone used to being mistaken for younger than she was. Her hands were folded before her, and her uniform was ironed to stiffness at the collar. She met Battle's gaze with that mixture of deference and faint defensiveness peculiar to good housemaids, aware that she knew more than she should, but unsure whether it was proper to reveal it. "I brought the tea up just before 8, she said, her voice careful, not shy. He didn't ring. That wasn't odd. Sir Edmund often preferred to be left. "And after 8? Battle asked. "I passed the study twice," she said, "once just before 9, on my way back from the linen press, and then again after 10. The door was closed both times." She hesitated. "There was a light beneath the door the first time, not the second." Battle did not prompt. The pause allowed its own gravity to settle. "I didn't think anything of it until morning," she added. He'd had spells before, quiet ones, times when he didn't wish to be disturbed. He regarded her evenly. "Did anyone else go in?" "I didn't see, but the passage was clear. The door never creaked." That was said with the subtle defensiveness of someone aware of being watched more than she watched. Who had access to the key? Battle asked. Mr. Fulbright. And Mrs. Fulbright. The housekeeper too, but she only ever used it on his instructions. He inclined his head. She looked down at her hands, then added, almost inaudibly, someone else was in there. Before morning. I'm sure of it. She didn't elaborate, and Battle didn't ask her to. He made the request in passing, as if it bore no more weight than the asking of a towel or an ashtray. Yet the request hung for a moment in the air, as requests like these always did. It was the housekeeper who gave the nod. There was no protest, only a small flick of the eyes from Eleanor, who stood nearby but said nothing. So set Widstithint. Lydia's room had the faded neutrality of guest quarters. Pleasant, but without attachment. The bed was neatly made, the dressing table empty save for a hairbrush and a leather-bound book of psalms. Battle moved quietly, his hands behind his back, eyes falling upon the small bookshelf, the single handbag tucked under the chair, and the wardrobe door left slightly ajar. He stepped once into the space, not intruding so much as weighing. He opened no drawers. Instead, his eyes found the single item that did not belong to the room's arrangement. A photograph, faintly worn, tucked between the pages of the prayer book. It showed a younger Sir Edmund standing beside a woman, not Lydia, but someone like her. The resemblance was neither subtle nor accidental. He replaced it precisely where it had been. He left the room not with urgency, but with an expression slightly changed, not in surprise, but in confirmation. The prayer book was bound in black Morocco leather, the edges softly worn by use. Its ribbon marker had been drawn halfway through the Psalms, precisely aligned, as though its reader had paused not by habit, but by thought. The room was still, and Battle moved with care, not to conceal his inspection, but to preserve the atmosphere that had shaped the object. He did not rush. Books like these were rarely kept for religion alone. The photograph, when drawn gently from between the pages, had the sepia brittleness of older things cherished too long. It was creased, but not folded, its corners dog-eared, the image faintly faded. The pose was unassuming. Sir Edmund stood at slight ease, hands behind his back, jacket open. Beside him, seated on a stone bench, a woman in a plain summer dress, not smiling, not quite solemn. Her posture suggested no intimacy, and yet there was something in the space between them, not distance but discretion. Battle studied the woman's face. She was neither beautiful nor plain. Her expression was composed, unforced, but the likeness, that was unmistakable. The eyes held the same meditative stillness as Lydia's, the same inwardness that made ordinary speech feel like interruption. The image told no story in itself. No names, no date, no inscription, and yet it placed the girl in a history the others refused to name. There were silences in this house that had been chosen, not fallen into. He returned the photograph with the same careful pressure that had lifted it. Its presence within the Psalms spoke of ritual, of memory, perhaps even of reverence. It had not been placed there in carelessness nor in hope. It had been hidden in the one place no one was likely to look unless they already suspected. Battle stepped back from the dressing table. Outside the window the yew trees stirred faintly in the wind, but inside the room everything remained still. He paused, not in indecision, but in reflection. One kind of inheritance was written into parchment and sealed in wax. Another was folded into quiet pages too intimate for courtrooms. One told the law, the other told the truth. Eleanor was waiting by the corridor that led to the upper landing, or rather she had stationed herself there without declaring it. Her back was to the window, her posture composed, the angle of her chin, the half-fold of her arms, all signaled civility. But her tone, when she spoke, carried none. "I should like a word, Miss Grey." Lydia had emerged from the east wing stair, uncertain. Her expression was unguarded, not frightened, but unsettled, like someone stepping into a room they had thought empty. She stopped a few paces away. The carpet dulled the sound of her steps. Eleanor did not raise her voice. "You've made yourself very comfortable in this house." Lydia's brows rose faintly. "I was shown here." "Yes," Eleanor said with clipped precision, "shown, not invited." There was a pause. Lydia made no reply. Eleanor's next words came more softly. "You expect it all, I imagine. The land, the house, the title." "That letter Mr. Monsil read made it very clear." Lydia's mouth parted, then closed. "I didn't know what was in it." "Didn't you?" Eleanor asked, her voice low, dangerously calm. "And yet you came, not in mourning, not even in gratitude, just acceptance." The pause stretched. "I never asked for it," Lydia said, voice steady, but not defiant. "No," Eleanor murmured. "That's the cleverest part." The silence after was weightier than any insult. It carried accusation without evidence, judgment without recourse. "I knew your mother," Eleanor added, almost idly. "We all did. My husband pretends not to remember, but then some men can afford to forget." Lydia turned then, not sharply, but with the dignity of someone choosing not to respond. Her posture, as she moved past, was neither retreat nor submission. It was simply removal. But Eleanor's voice followed her. "Don't mistake politeness for acceptance, my dear. This house has long memories." And then she was gone, her footsteps echoing faintly against the gallery wall, her poise untouched, her anger hidden, barely, beneath porcelain restraint. Battle stood at the curve of the staircase, behind the arch that led to the lower hall. He had not stepped into view. Nor had he moved to listen. He had simply been there, as he often was, unnoticed. He did not speak, nor follow. He made no note, gave no sign. But what he had heard, off, tone, not content, required no repetition. The venom in Eleanor's voice had not been born of surprise. It had been aged, cellared, waiting. It told him not only of a woman who feared loss, but of one who had believed herself immune to change. He stepped back once more into the shadows, allowing the scene to dissolve behind the hush of the house's old walls. What had passed between the two women would not be recorded, but it had already shaped the narrative far more than any testimony. The request was worded plainly, in Battle's usual hand, discreet, without flourish, and designed to provoke no attention should it be read by someone for whom it was not intended. He had long learned that certain truths revealed themselves only when no one thought they were being sought. It was addressed not to a laboratory, but to a particular man in an unlisted office on the 4th floor of a building in Bloomsbury, a man who, for reasons of temperament and discretion, had become accustomed to questions asked without urgency and answered without comment. The envelope was delivered by hand. No signature, no receipt. The document enclosed was a sample of the amended will, extracted without alerting Mr. Monsil or his clerks. The instruction was brief. Compare ink to standard house supply, confirm instrument, batch, and probable origin. Battle's name appeared nowhere on the page. He left the note with the Morning Post and said nothing to anyone. Instead, he returned to his office and reviewed the seating arrangement from his last interview with Monsil, who had passed the will across the desk without fanfare. its seal unbroken, its date too neatly aligned with the hour of death. Some things were altered deliberately, others revealed themselves in the brush of a pen not meant to be held. The reply came 2 days later, folded once with no envelope, a single sentence typed with precision. Ink is of commercial variety not identical to sample from Sir Edmund's study. Beneath it, a second line, handwritten, likely applied with pen not present at the property. Battle read the note once, then placed it carefully in a drawer and locked it. He did not speak of it, nor make mention of the pen again, not even when shown the one recovered from the desk at Honeygarth, still resting with dried residue beneath the nib, too fine for the pressure seen on the will's final stroke. Instead he requested a list, unrecorded, informal, of all pens kept at the firm of Fell and Monsil. The junior partner hesitated only briefly before providing it. One name appeared twice, one was marked withdrawn from use. The rest Battle thought could wait. She had arrived unannounced, a grey silk scarf pinned modestly at her collar, her gloves worn at the fingertips from nervous fidgeting more than labor. Anne Carrow, cousin to the Fulbrights by marriage and known to few, she was not part of the inheritance, nor of the quarrels that circled it. But she came with something more telling than property, a memory. "I thought someone ought to see this," she said, placing the folded sheet of stationery on Battle's desk. "It came to me 2 weeks before he died." The paper bore the unmistakable hand of Sir Edmund, round, deliberate, slightly slanted. The message, though brief, had the tone of someone unaccustomed to uncertainty but newly familiar with its weight. "My dear Anne, you were always the clearest head in the family, and I find myself in need of one. I may have done something I cannot undo, not out of malice, but of conscience. I fear it will not be understood. If there is any noise about it, let them know it was mine to do, mine to regret, if need be." Battle read it twice, then once more. He asked no immediate question. The silences, as always, told more. Anne remained seated, hands folded, her posture unchanged. "I never replied," she said, faintly. "I didn't know what to say." Battle folded the letter again, restoring the creases, and tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat. Some regrets, he knew, were not meant to be explained, only revealed. It was the use of the word misunderstood that caught him, not challenged, not opposed, but misunderstood. Sir Edmund, who prided himself on clarity, in business, in speech, in legacy, had chosen a word of vagueness, of emotional ambiguity. It suggested not fear of contradiction, but fear of misreading, of motive mistaken, of act interpreted through the lens of those who knew only half the story. Battle studied the phrasing. It bore the shape of a man trying to square legality with something older, something rooted in sentiment, perhaps even guilt. The decision to alter the will had not been made in haste, but the fear of its reception, that had come late, and come hard. The signature, Battle now recalled, had borne an extra loop, faint, but present, a hesitation in the middle of Edmund's firm scrawl, not a tremor of age, a faltering of resolve. One does not fear being misunderstood, unless one knows there is something to conceal. The registry office of Fell and Monsil was a quiet back room, its shelves lined not with law but with continuity, birth, death, marriage, deed. Clerks moved here with a reverence one usually reserved for libraries or chapels. Battle stood to one side, watching, not intrusively, but long enough to notice who whispered and who did not. A clerk in shirt sleeves, older than the rest, shifted the files more slowly than necessary. His eyes lingered on a page too long. Battle noted the time of day, just past 4, when most men begin to finish, but do not yet leave. The logbook bore no entry for the will's resubmission, but the dated seal showed a discrepancy, filed on the 17th, yet signed on the 15th. A mistake, perhaps, but unlikely. These clerks Battle knew, lived by the calendar, and died by the stamp. One murmured line, caught as Battle passed through the corridor, wasn't supposed to go in until after. No name attached, no eye contact made, but the tone was one of irritation, not secrecy. Someone had tampered not with the document itself, but its timing. And in a state such as this, timing was everything. The diary was not one Battle had expected to find. It had been stored among Sir Edmund's more personal effects, bound in soft leather, the pages closely written, the entries sparse but exact. He did not read it fully, that was not his purpose. Instead, he searched for margin notes, the signs of second thoughts or reconsidered truths. On a Tuesday entry, 4 months before death, there it was, a name, hastily penciled in a looser hand, R. Sneath, not underlined, not followed by a remark, simply written, and beneath it, faintly, the remains of an erasure. The line struck not through the name itself, but through the space beside it, as though the writer had hesitated about what to add, then changed his mind. Sneath. A clerk dismissed under quiet circumstances from Fell and Monsil, nearly a year ago, officially for lateness, unofficially for discretion, or the lack of it. Battle closed the diary gently. Names when scratched into margins rarely meant nothing, they were the ghosts of half-decisions, and those more than full actions left fingerprints behind. The coffee house off Queen Victoria Street had little charm. Its chairs were stiff-backed, the windows fogged from steam, and the staff indifferent to their patrons' names or needs. Yet it had the virtue of anonymity, and that was precisely what Ronald Sneath seemed to require. He arrived punctually, neither late enough to seem evasive, nor early enough to suggest anxiety. He wore a coat 1 season too old, and gloves with a faint nick at the thumb. His hair, dark and thinning, was parted with excessive care, as if the control of that line might restore the order of others more frayed. He recognized Battle immediately, of course, though he said nothing to confirm it. He only sat, folded his hands, and waited. There was a scent about him, not of ink, as one might expect from a clerk, but of tobacco kept too long in a pocket. "I'm no longer with the firm," Sneath said at last. His voice was sharp, but not theatrical, the sharpness of a man who had been dismissed, not defeated. Battle gave a small nod, as though the statement had been offered, not in explanation, but as a line item in an accounting. "I wasn't dismissed for dishonesty," Sneath added quickly, "for lateness. That's what they said." He looked down at his hands. "I was asked to do something small, something that, at the time, seemed beneath notice." Battle said nothing. He reached for a teaspoon, stirred his cup once, then placed the spoon back on the saucer with absolute precision. Sneath leaned forward, his voice lowering without invitation. "The will was submitted 2 days earlier than it should have been. I was told it ought to arrive after the date of death, not before. A courtesy, to avoid family trouble. Nothing forged, nothing changed, just rescheduled." He looked up then, as if expecting rebuke or disbelief. "He orders, his effectable pop." Battle only watched him, the lines of his face composed, unreadable. "The signature was real," Sneath said. "I saw it myself, but the intent, that's where it grew murky. I wasn't told who gave the instruction, just that it came from someone above me, and when it was done, I was let go." A pause settled between them. Sneath shifted in his seat, and for a moment, the bitterness beneath his composure showed itself, not in words, but in the tightening of his jaw, and the tremor of the fingers that touched the rim of his teacup, once, then twice, as though tapping out a message only he could read. It wasn't illegal, Sneath insisted, only inconvenient. His tone had softened now, not conciliatory, but explanatory, as if he had retreated into the comfort of logic. Documents arrive after the fact all the time. Death complicates everything. The firm has procedures for such things. I was merely asked to hold the envelope. Battle raised his eyes to meet his. By whom? The question was asked without emphasis, without pause, a question delivered not as a challenge, but as a matter of clerical interest. Sneath blinked. It came through the junior partner. I assumed it was at the client's request. And which client was that? There was a pause, a long one. Sneath's mouth moved, but no name emerged. I wasn't told directly, he said at last, only implied. Battle nodded once. He did not press the point. A man like Sneath was more likely to betray the truth by omission than by denial. The lie would not come in speech, but in the moment he chose not to speak. He sipped his tea again. It had gone lukewarm. Sneath looked away, the flush in his cheek betraying more than the words he had offered. It was just a procedural matter, he said again, fainter now. Nothing more. Battle set down his cup. He had heard enough. She entered the solicitor's conference room with the dignity of a woman accustomed to such spaces, not unfamiliar, but not quite at ease. Her gloves were still on, her hat immaculate. A brooch of modest pearl fastened the collar of her coat, and the crispness of her silhouette stood in contrast to the fading upholstery of the room. She paused a moment at the door, her gaze traveling over the polished surface of the table, the dull brass keyhole on the window latch, the subtle alignment of the chairs. Battle rose and gestured toward a seat opposite, neither deferential nor distant. It was a gesture used in courtrooms, at embassies, and when offering silence as a gift rather than a weapon. She sat, slowly, crossing her ankles with the care of one who understood that balance began in posture. "You wish to speak with me," she said, her voice unhurried. Battle did not respond immediately. His fingers rested on a closed folder. The file remained untouched. "I thought it better," he said, "before others are spoken to." A beat passed. Not long, but enough to shift the temperature of the room. Eleanor inclined her head slightly, not as thanks, but as acknowledgment. "I see." He did not elaborate. He did not accuse. The space he left between his words was not hesitation but invitation. "Then I presume," she said softly, "you have come to some conclusion." Still, he said nothing. She folded her hands on the table. Her nails were short and unpainted. "You believe I acted improperly, that I interfered." Battle did not nod, nor did he contradict her. She drew a breath, not deeply. "You are right, of course, in part. But I would ask you to consider whether impropriety can ever be judged without context." The faintest hint of something moved beneath her surface. Not fear, not confession. Calculation, laced with history. "I did not alter the will. I did not forge his name. But I knew it was being changed. And I did not stop it." Battle regarded her with a neutrality that was not indifference but a form of respect. "I could not." He had made his choice, and to oppose it, at that stage, would have brought disgrace. Her gaze did not falter, not to him, to us. "The house," she began, her voice quiet but clipped, "was built with an understanding that certain matters would remain unstated, and certain roles unchallenged." She looked away from him now, toward the window's grey glass, though she could see nothing beyond it. "When the girl appeared, years ago just once, it was explained to me as a kindness, a debt of gratitude to a nurse. Nothing else." Battle remained still, but something changed. "I saw it before Edmund ever said a word." He became reflective, distracted. The sort of distraction that doesn't come from illness, but from remembrance. She straightened slightly. I spoke to him once. I asked him whether he truly wished to alter everything he had built, not materially, but in name, in legacy. He said very little. That was his way. There was no tremor in her voice, but there was perhaps a narrowing of breath. I did not attempt to stop the process, but I did seek advice. Quietly, I mentioned to a colleague at the firm that there might be value in letting things settle, that some documents are better filed cautiously. She paused. If you call that interference, then I will accept the term, but I do not regret it. Battle opened the folder, not to read, but to lift a single sheet, the laboratory analysis, ink noted as foreign. He laid it down, face up, and said nothing. Eleanor's eyes flicked to it. She did not look away. I see, she said softly. So you've come for confirmation, not discovery. He gave no reply. His silence said enough. It was in the shift of her jaw that it broke, just slightly, enough to betray the fault line beneath her poise. Her words when they came next were quicker, edged. I gave him everything, she said. I managed the accounts, the staff, the obligations. I buried the petty scandals and shielded him from Parliament and family alike. Her voice had risen only a fraction, but the edge was unmistakable. And then she returns, out of the blue, after all those years, looking down, eyes lowered, pretending not to know the weight of what she carried. She stopped herself, lips tightening. Battle's head tilted, a mere fraction, the way a man tilts toward a confession when he knows it will not come in words. Eleanor exhaled slowly. It was not greed. It was not revenge. It was protection. That name, the Fulbright name, is not hers to bear. Battle folded the paper once again and placed it gently back in the file. Eleanor stood. I imagine you'll speak with Leonard next, she said quietly. He said nothing. She turned toward the door, her composure resumed, the angle of her spine unbroken, but the weight had shifted, and Battle, who had watched the truth unspoken in courts, in kitchens, and in corridors, understood that her motives had not withered, only solidified. The note delivered to felon Monsil bore no seal, only a name written in Battle's distinctive hand, modest, exact, deliberate. Mr. Monsil opened it with the same careful attention he gave to last testaments and contested codicils. The message was brief, a request that certain persons be made available at the solicitor's offices on Wednesday morning, at 10 precisely, for a final clarification regarding the will of Sir Edmund Fulbright. No summons was issued. That was not Battle's way. He preferred instead the pressure of civility, the unspoken command embedded in a polite invitation. It was a habit born from years of observation. People were more candid in the presence of normality than they ever were under threat. By the appointed hour, the drawing room reserved for private consultations had been arranged. The table, polished to an unforgiving shine, bore no papers save for a single sealed envelope resting precisely in the center. 3 chairs had been drawn forward. A 4th, slightly apart, had been positioned for Battle. Eleanor arrived first, gloves removed but coat unbuttoned, a small signal of dignity preserved rather than ease offered. Leonard followed, a minute late, his step too quick, his breathing just shallow enough to suggest he had debated whether to come at all. Lydia entered last, accompanied by Monsil, her expression unreadable, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Battle stood only briefly when they entered, a gesture more functional than formal, then sat with the stillness that always preceded his words. "Thank you," he said, his voice as level as ever, "for coming." He did not speak again for nearly a minute. The silence filled the room with that peculiar gravity which seems to belong only to unread letters and locked drawers. When he began, it was not with accusation, but with chronology. The will was altered on the 15th, he began, speaking not to any one person, but to the air itself, impartial, judicial. It was submitted on the 17th. It should have been submitted on the 18th. No one moved. The ink used on the document does not match that kept in Sir Edmund's study, nor does the pen. The handwriting bears irregularities inconsistent with his usual pressure, particularly in the final loop of his surname. Leonard shifted, subtly, not a flinch. A slight movement of the thumb against the seam of his trouser leg, a restless gesture that did not belong to the hour. Battle's tone did not change. The sealed letter meant for Mr. Monsil was seen on Sir Edmund's blotter the night of his death. It was not present the following morning. Fragments of its wax seal were found in the hearth. The signature on the new will was made with hesitation, not with infirmity, but with interruption. He paused then, his gaze resting for a moment on the edge of the table, not on the faces around it, but on the wood grain, as if the truth were written there in quieter lines. A call was made from Honeygarth at 10:15 that evening. No name was given, but the housekeeper confirmed Sir Edmund was alive at 8 and unresponsive by 10. He had dismissed the staff by 9:30. Between those hours, the study was entered. He looked up now deliberately. The ink-pot was dry. A silence followed. Not shocked, not yet, but waited, the kind that resists reply because too many calculations are underway behind closed mouths. Battle continued, still without emphasis. A document signed in haste, a letter burned, an envelope filed too early. These are not the signs of planning, but of panic. Someone acted in that interval, not to create a forgery from scratch, but to conceal a truth that had become inconvenient. He paused once more. I believe the intention to alter the will was genuine. I believe Sir Edmund made that decision with full clarity, but I also believe someone feared what that document would reveal, not in its content, but in its implications. His eyes moved at last to Leonard, and then to Eleanor. Neither spoke. Not yet. The pause after Battle's quiet recitation had lengthened, not uncomfortably, but with that particular tension which arises when everyone in a room knows something crucial has not yet been said. Leonard's gaze had settled not on Battle, but on the edge of the solicitor's table, where a minute's scratch in the polish, no longer than a paperclip, seemed to draw and hold his attention with undue force. Battle, still seated, adjusted a document from the stack beside him. It was folded crisply, marked by official stamps, the sort kept in military archives, and seldom retrieved without particular cause. He opened it without comment, flattening the page with deliberate care. His finger rested briefly on a single line of handwriting. The 1919 discharge form, he said, not lifting his gaze. Filed in Ghent, a minor technicality, a missing line of service verification, if I recall, corrected by hand. The silence that followed was of a different nature. Not confusion nor alarm, but something colder, a tightening of breath, a stilling of shoulders. I have spoken with the archives at Whitehall. The record shows the amendment was made in your hand, Major Fulbright, without authorization. A forgery, in effect. Leonard's mouth moved slightly, as though to form a protest, but nothing emerged. There was no denial in his face, only an old resentment, not at being accused, but at being reminded. The past, like a poor tailor's thread, always showed at the seam.
Yeah.
Battle allowed the silence to swell again before continuing. It was minor, yes, done no doubt with the usual motives, reputation, economy, avoidance of delay. But even in such cases, the hand that writes out of desperation has a rhythm, a cadence. He placed a second sheet beside the first, a facsimile of the contested will. His finger traced unhurriedly the signature at the bottom. The loops on the FR were too clean. The pressure in the tail of the G too deliberate. Not Sir Edmund's style, but they matched the 1919 form rather well. Now Leonard looked up, and the set of his jaw betrayed not outrage, but calculation. He was thinking, not about denial but containment, the first instinct of those trained in command. Battle said nothing further, and Monsil, whose gaze had flickered once to Eleanor, now returned to the will, as though he might read anew what had long been filed and forgotten. Lydia remained very still, her chin slightly lowered, though her eyes had not left Leonard since the word forgery. "It wasn't theft," Leonard said at last. The words came slow, but with deliberate control. The will, it was already there. He stopped, not because he lacked a justification, but because none would serve. His voice did not falter. It was not contrition but wounded pride that dulled its edge. Battle inclined his head slightly. No judgment, no sympathy. Only the calm of a man who already knew what had happened, and had only waited for the person involved to arrive at the same realization. There was no arrest made, no accusation leveled aloud, but the shame of the moment exposed without force, acknowledged without plea, lingered in the air long after Leonard had looked away. Battle turned next to the stack of legal papers at his side. His fingertips brushed the sealed envelope once more, the one meant for Mr. Monsil, long presumed lost. It had not been stolen. Not exactly, the letter said, addressing no one and everyone, was retrieved from the hearth. Partially, the seal was broken and burned. The paper had not turned to ash completely. A few words remained, though the signature was gone. Leonard closed his eyes, only briefly, but enough. Battle noted the reflex, not guilt, exactly, but the fatigue of having watched something he had once valued burn, and not in a blaze of purpose, but in the muddled heat of panic. "You found it," Battle said, "before the staff did, after he died. You read it, standing over him, the house still quiet, and you thought, then it might be safer if it disappeared." Leonard did not confirm it, he merely breathed through his nose and said nothing. But the truth had already passed into the room. There was no denying what had not been asked, only acknowledging the shape it had left behind. It had not been ambition, nor cruelty, nor even malice. It had been pride, old, soldierly, brittle, and the fear of being seen as lesser by the man whose approval had never quite been earned. The letter, once opened, had not threatened his inheritance, only revealed the measure by which he had fallen short, and that in the end had proved intolerable. The room had grown quieter, not through absence of words, but by their weight. Eleanor sat with her back held rigid, the delicate veins in her hands pressed against the lacquered arms of the chair. Leonard remained standing, not out of pride, but because sitting might suggest surrender. Lydia, with her customary stillness, had said nothing since the last revelation, and yet it was upon her that the moment now turned, in the quiet gravity that only blood and names could command. Battle, never one to prolong silence for effect, nonetheless allowed this one its duration. He stood before the fireplace, not dramatically, but simply as a man who had heard, weighed, and understood more than most would ever say aloud. "It was not a question of money," he said, his voice as flat and unimpressed as though reciting a grocery list. "Sir Edmund had enough to leave to all and still be generous." He let the statement remain unanswered. "It wasn't a question, it was the name," he continued. "The name that couldn't go forward on the back of a girl born outside the register. Not because she was unworthy, but because you feared how it would look. The scandal in county journals, the awkward questions at the club. A legacy once questioned becomes brittle, and brittle things snap. Eleanor's nostrils flared. She had no right to. She had a right to nothing. Battle interjected, almost gently. But that doesn't mean she asked for anything. His gaze moved slowly toward Lydia. She remained as she was, pale, composed, unmoved by either accusation or defense. There was in her expression no triumph, only the distant ache of a woman who had long since given up hoping to be recognized, and now found that recognition, when it came, bore a cost of its own. She is not to inherit by cunning or appeal. Battle continued. She was named in the will, the one Sir Edmund signed of his own accord, after years of quiet reflection, and after meeting her not once but several times, always outside the house, always quietly, because even affection in such houses must walk behind. Eleanor looked as though she might speak again, but no sound emerged. Her lips pressed into the thin porcelain line of social ruin just barely averted. Leonard turned away, not from shame, but from the unbearable arithmetic of a man who had always counted what he was owed, and now saw that some debts were never due to him. The motive, then, was not greed. It was fear, not of the girl, but of what she made visible, that Sir Edmund had lived a second life, however brief, of warmth, of repentance, of naming what had once gone unnamed. That in her, the old man had tried to leave behind not land nor title, nor fortune, but truth. A truth so many in the room had spent their lives ensuring would never be spoken aloud. Battle, when he rose the next morning and walked once more through the long gravelled drive of Honeygarth, did not carry a file or a summons. He came not as detective, nor enforcer, but as a man who had heard the last of the confessions and expected no more. He found Lydia in the east parlour, surrounded by the paper remnants of legal drafts. She was alone, seated at a writing desk, her hands folded atop a letter from Monsil that required her signature, and returned to her, at last, what had been denied by silence. The house, no longer hostile, had entered the kind of stillness that precedes decisions. She stood when she saw him, not abruptly, but with the quiet formality of someone not raised in such surroundings, yet intuitively aware of how they worked. "I won't keep it," she said. "Not the house, not as it is." Battle inclined his head slightly. "I've spoken with Dr. Elston," she continued. "His convalescent patients from the war. They've nowhere now. The house is too large for one, too cold perhaps, but it can be changed." There was a moment where her voice caught, not with emotion but restraint. "He said there was funding. If I were to donate the grounds they could begin renovations by winter." She hesitated, watching Battle for signs of judgment. "There were none. I never wanted his money," she added, quietly. Only to be told I wasn't a mistake. Battle looked around the room. The portraits still on the wall, the mahogany shining with too many polishes, the clock that ticked with the same relentless rhythm, no matter who sat beneath it. "Some houses," he said at last, "have to unlearn their habits." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then, taking the pen, she signed. By the time Battle took his coat and returned to the drive, the sky had grown overcast. He did not speak to the footman who opened the door, nor acknowledge the butler's quiet murmur of "Inspector." The gates swung open without ceremony, and he passed through them with the even, unhurried step of a man who had no further use for doorways that kept people in or out. He carried no briefcase, no evidence. There would be a report, naturally, but nothing urgent. Nothing that required more than the simple truth that a man had died, a will had been questioned, and something deeper than crime had been uncovered. The tremor that runs beneath names, when spoken aloud for the first time. The truth had not shaken the house, but it had settled it. And Superintendent Battle, a man who measured victory not by confession but by silence, left without comment. Some truths are so heavy with silence, they do not echo when spoken, they simply remain, like dust on an unopened book. But even the quietest justice has a sound, if one listens with care. Was it shame that forged the signature, or love twisted by fear of what the world would say? Tell me, what do you believe truly motivated the final deception? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found something haunting, human or hidden in this tale, do stay with us. Like the best mysteries, the next one waits just beyond the silence. Like, share and subscribe for more.